Hello. You guys ready to talk about 5G? If not, you need to get up and go in another room. All right, you're all here voluntarily then. Awesome. Welcome to the second half of IGF USA 2019. And today we are going to be talking about the next generation of mobile technology known as 5G with this lovely panel here. So I have, to make sure I get this right, Francella, I got it because you mentioned it. Ochillo.
Francella Ochillo.
Okay.
Yes.
Who's the executive director of the Next Century Cities. Next to her, I have Evan Swarztrauber, who's a policy advisor at the Federal Communications Commission, followed by Trish Paoletta, who is a partner at Harris, Wiltshire, Grannis, and Sanjay Udani. Okay. Well, he's vice president for technology policy at Verizon Communication. And we are just going to dive right into this lovely topic, and we're going to expect lots of smart questions from you people towards the end. Sanjay, I want to start with you. Can you explain to us what we're moving from 4G to 5G? What does this mean?
That's a great question.
Can you bring your microphone just a little closer?
Yeah, sure.
There you go. Just so everybody knows, this is being recorded. So if you do not want your face to be on the video, you need to leave. And this will be available later both on audio and visual. And thanks to one of our lovely colleagues, these are all transcribed. So that's just great for people to know.
Sure. So we've all heard the hype about 5G. It's going to solve everything. I think that's a little bit overblown. But what 5G really is a big change from what we're used to. So as we went from 2G to 3G to 4G, the biggest change was speed, right? We just went from dial-up speeds to single-digit megabits to double-digit megabits. You could now stream video. So 5G will improve on that, but there's a whole other set of criteria that it's going to improve on that we didn't have before. And so that's going to enable some of the things that we're going to be talking about on this panel in a little bit. So I would say the biggest thing you should think about with 5G is it's not just more speed. If that was the case, I wouldn't be here.
So I think about 3G to 4G being, I used to be able to talk on what we still call a phone, but I couldn't text and talk at the same time. Right. And 4G means I can still play with all the things on the phone and talk on the phone. And actually watch video, which is awesome. So 5G, you're saying, is not just about speed, and we've got latency issues. So we're going to be doing a lot of things, but I think there's still, humans like to make everything about themselves. So it's not so much about the device in our hand being that much faster, it's about everything else that's connected to it?
Correct. So you mentioned the key point about latency. One of the things that we can't do well on a scale nowadays is anything interactive. So if you're trying to do some sort of virtual reality, augmented reality thing where you're interacting with a large number of people, the existing networks can't really do that on scale. That's one of the things that 5G will enable, where you can now do things where it's as if you're there. You're interacting with the other person almost instantaneously. Now, there's some limits to this. You can't do this if it's halfway around the world. So we are not getting around the laws of physics anytime soon. But some of these things where the interaction, the interactivity is going to change a lot in terms of the services that we can offer. The other big thing, I think, is the density of devices. So if you think about the number of people in this room, the traditional Wi-Fi, the traditional small cells are not geared to handle a large number of devices or people in any given area. With 5G, we're talking about 1 million devices in a square kilometer. So the density of devices that you can do with 5G is going to be mind-blowing, and I think that's what's going to enable some of the other things that we talk about, IoT, smart cities. None of that stuff works if you have too many devices that can't connect. And we see this all the time, right? You go to a hotel, an airport, the Wi-Fi signal is there, it's strong, but you try to do anything and nothing really happens. So that's one of the issues that 5G solves.
Fantastic. So Tricia, that sounds like the tech guys the engineers have some pretty good ideas. Globally, are we ready for that?
Well, we're trying to get ready. For those of you who are, UN followers, that's probably most of the IGF crowd, there is a United Nations body called the International Telecommunication Union, the ITU. And about every 4 years, they have a global conference. It's the World Radio Conference, or WARC, as we say, WRC, and that there is one coming up at the end of the year. And we're trying to get ready for that, for 5G, because you can't really have 5G without more spectrum for 5G. And, Sanjay touched on this, but there's a number of different use cases for 5G. There's, Sanjay mentioned the Internet of Things, millions and millions of devices being connected, Internet of Things. That's one set of use cases. Then there's the consumer application, faster, more high-capacity apps on your smartphone or your tablet or whatever. And then there's critical mission uses like, remote surgeries or earthquake sensing or, other public safety or, critical use, utility applications that are, and connected cars obviously being one of them. So the World Radio Conference coming up at the end of the year for about a month has a number of agenda items that will touch on 5G. And one of them, 113, for those who actually have to follow this by the number, is looking at spectrum for 5G, but in the millimeter wave band. So that, the higher wave, millimeter, that's 24 to 86 gigahertz. And that's going to be high capacity, not broad coverage, but huge high capacity. So that's good for some use cases. And it might be for IoT in a small setting like a factory. Also for densification of urban networks like Washington D.C. or New York, where again for the consumer enhanced mobile broadband applications. So we're looking at those high frequency bands or millimeter wave bands at this work that's coming up. That's a priority for a number of countries, certainly including the United States. And then there's other bands that are kicking around that might be applicable for some of the other use cases, critical mission and, or I guess it's called ULRIC. It's a long acronym, which we'll get into if anybody asks. But we're getting ready. Thank you.
Awesome. Evan, Chairman Pai tweeted earlier this week that a 5G box is this, he says that we shouldn't be using the rules for current 4G because we're going to be dealing with something that's the size of a shoebox and has the lifespan of a guinea pig. Which I actually tweeted back. I'm like, now I have to go find out what the lifespan of a guinea pig is. And then I mentioned that to somebody later, because apparently it's 4 to 6 years, and she said, apparently there's not a cat around. So what do you say to that? What are we getting ready for here?
Quick point of clarification. He was talking about small satellites that dissolve in the atmosphere. I really hope, Sanjay, that Verizon small cells last longer than a guinea pig.
I was going to ask, you got to tell me what the guinea pig life is.
Yeah.
I don't.
Otherwise, we got some serious
according to the
problems.
Google machine, 4 to 6 years if it's not touched by a cat.
Right, but the general point about right-size regulation, thank you all for having me. I work for Commissioner Carr at the FCC. He's been taking the lead on some 5G issues.
Do you want to tell us now these are your own views and not those of the commission? Because that's probably what you're supposed to say next.
No, that's cool. I think they should be everyone's views.
Everybody should adopt your
Everyone
views.
should agree with me, yes. So when the FCC took over in 2017, this current makeup of the FCC, one of the things we noticed is that it simply took too long and cost too much to build wireless infrastructure. And we were at risk of ceding U.S. leadership in wireless, which we had in 4G, to China and other competitors when it comes to 5G. We needed to take bold action because, as Shane mentioned, the regulation should have some relationship to the size and impact of the product. A 200-foot macro cell tower, which most of us are familiar with as how we get cell service. You're driving around the highway, you see a big tower. That's not always going to be the case with 5G. We're going to have small cells hanging on a street lamp, and if you apply the same regulatory muck to something that's this big as something that's 200 feet, that just doesn't make sense. So the two big steps we did at the FCC, in March of 2018, we reformed the federal siting requirements for small cells and also for macro towers. In September of 2018, we put guardrails on the state and local fees and shot clocks for reviewing these applications, the fees that are charged to providers, because we want to see more of this infrastructure deployed. At the government, our job is not to create the product and to figure out the use case. Our job is to take regulatory costs out of the system so that we can get this infrastructure deployed quickly. And I'll share a couple of compelling results that we've seen as these regulatory reforms have taken place. Right now, internet speeds in the U.S. are up 40% as the prior year. In 2017, around 13,000 small cells were deployed. In 2018, that jumped to over 60,000. Just in the wake of our March 2018 regulatory reform, one provider reported clearing small cells for construction at 6 times the pace of before. And these macro numbers may all sound not very compelling because you have to humanize them, but we're seeing this on the ground as well. My boss and I have traveled all over the country. He's been to 30 different states. We're seeing a manufacturing plant in South Carolina that makes small cells, doubling their production, hiring new workers for steel. These are good 5G manufacturing jobs. We saw a manufacturing plant in small town Elkmont, Alabama, that's doubling their output of the tower harnesses, the literal safety equipment that people wear to deploy this infrastructure. So it's not just about the software, which is great, and Silicon Valley and those folks that are going to be creating the applications that are used over this network. This also means real good middle-class jobs for people in rural areas, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's tower climbing. There's an entire ecosystem that benefits when we take regulatory costs out of the system and accelerate deployment. So that's been our focus, and I'll step off my soapbox for a second before I take up all of our time.
Well, you could. Francella, it sounds like we're talking about your people here. These are small cells going into cities, making cities smarter. Are we happy, sad about that, somewhere in the middle?
I think there's definitely some room in the middle. So yes, my name is Francella, and I am Executive Director at Next Century Cities, and we are a nonpartisan membership organization that represents community members that span all the way from Honolulu, Hawaii, all the way to Rockport, Maine, across the country in 40 different states. And as Evan just mentioned, our job is to humanize the story, because the truth is that local leaders are the ones who have to essentially implement digital access initiatives and essentially have to navigate around state and federal policies that may either support or hinder their local initiatives. When we're thinking about our membership, they represent a geographically and also demographically diverse population. We might have towns like we might have cities like San Francisco or Seattle, Washington, or even Baltimore, Maryland, who have high populations, high connectivity, and when they think about 5G, it looks very different than maybe people in Winthrop or in some small parts of the country in rural areas. And when we think about, for me, I think 5G is going to be something that is literally putting connectivity on steroids for people who have it. I totally agree with some of the earlier remarks that this is something that's going to change the way that we think about how people are able to interact with their city governments, maybe the way that they're able to actually access city services, engage in remote learning, have telemedicine initiatives that just don't even exist, remote learning possibilities. I think that this is going to unleash all sorts of benefits for those who are connected. However, there's a large swath of the population that has no connectivity at all, or at least limited and unreliable connectivity. So what unites our members that might be very different, they are all committed to one thing, and just providing universal, reliable access for their residents wherever they are. And so when we think about what is 5G really going to mean to them, I think that it's a combination of finding ways to make sure that it's equitably deployed around their cities if they do have connectivity. For all of them, they're always constantly thinking about what are the minefields around state and federal regulation. And also, I think in general, our charge as people who represent them here in Washington, D.C., is to make sure that they're part of the original strategy to deploy 5G and not just an afterthought.
Or I think that travel agents should have a whole area called No G.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is when all of us are like ready to get out of this town. You're like, is there no G there? That would be great. So going back to the other side of the table, Sanjay, it sounds like we got a lot of infrastructure build out that's going on, or going to be going on. Where are we in that process, and how's it going?
So the 5G build-out has started. We as in Verizon, we've announced 20 cities this year, of which we've started build-outs in 5 so far. And then that's just for the mobile connectivity. For the fixed wireless connectivity, which I think is a very interesting alternative that is going to be, it doesn't get a lot of buzz, but I think that's going to be a big one going forward. We've deployed in 4 cities so far, and that is basically replacing your existing broadband home connection, where instead of having cable or fiber or dial-up or DSL going to your home, you now use 5G connections as your home connection. So we've deployed that. We are currently deploying roughly 1,000 route miles of fiber a month, just to get all of this off the ground. So the build out is happening. It's real. It takes time. So when I read articles saying, well, we walked around here and we only saw 5G in these places. Yeah, this stuff is not that easy to build out, as we talked about here, in terms of getting permits and whatnot, but also just the equipment. This is not going to happen overnight, but we're building as fast as we can at this point.
takes a lot of capital to make that happen.
Yeah, that too. So we, as Verizon, we've spent between $16 to $17 billion a year on CapEx for the past, I'd say, decade plus. And that's going to continue. So when we talk about building this out, it's not just putting a little small cell and you're done. You now have to connect that small cell. You have to put the fiber in the ground to connect all of those thousands of small cells. And then once you put the fiber in, now you have to have all the equipment that goes with it. And then the most important thing, and this is the one that doesn't get discussed on panels because it's not that interesting, is the operations of it. Whether you're talking about security or having the network work well, you could have the best network in place, but if you don't maintain it and have it be managed properly, you have nothing. So that's another angle that we really have to pay a lot of attention to. So getting it right takes time. So we've sort of got these two things going, right? We're trying to deploy as quickly as we can, but at the same time, we're trying to do it the right way and not just kind of say, okay, we've got 5G, we're done. So
Tricia, does it make a difference if we deploy at a different level of spectrum than our international colleagues? Is there parity here? What are we focusing on?
Well, it does make a difference in terms of the economies of scale, right? And that's why the ITU, their basic mission is to try to harmonize spectrum globally if you can get it. Now, obviously that's hard to do, and there's an international table of allocations, and every megahertz of spectrum, or kilohertz actually, is allocated right now, up to 3,000 gigahertz. So, and everyone is allocated for multiple different services. So, these conferences every 4 years is to try to drill down and get some more granular harmonization, and always, international is not always possible, right? Because you do have multiple services allocated in each band. Some countries have chosen, gosh, there's mobile in this band. Maybe I'll do mobile radar off of Air Force, planes in this band, whereas another country wanted to do, mobile telephony. So it matters for economies of scale, and operators like Verizon and T-Mobile and and AT&T, everybody wants to have lower cost equipment. So that's why the vendors are often the drivers. The Ericssons, the Nokias, the Huaweis, whoever are the drivers of these programs. These agenda items at these world conferences to harmonize the bands. So it's cheaper, right? If you get economies of scale, it's cheaper for everybody. So it does matter, but to drill down into your question, probably at a level nobody cares about, but I find it fascinating.
Please tell.
As I already referenced, perhaps, 5G, no, I'm going. 5G spectrum is both low band, mid band, and high band. So the ITU, the World Radio Conference, is looking at high band, and again, that's for the densification of networks, and those are small cells. But here's another fascinating thing for the non-engineers in the room. The higher you go up in the spectrum, the smaller the propagation of the waves, so your antenna is smaller. If you're in the mid-band or low-band, your antenna is bigger. So when you talk about small cells and densifying urban networks for the people who already have connectivity, not Francella's people, you're talking about high-band spectrum. But outside of the ITU, because there's already demand out there, developed countries, the US, in Europe, in Asia, they're already looking at the mid-band spectrum. So that's why you sit in the United States, and and Evan's dealing with this, and Verizon and others are pushing on this. We need more mid-band spectrum, and that is also harmonizing outside of the ITU process in like the 3.3 up to the 4.2 gigahertz range of spectrum. So that's why we're seeing a lot of push on that. And again, people are pushing on that and telling Evan and his people, we need to win this race, we need to win this race, because they want enough spectrum in the mid-band as well as high band and low band for those economies of scale. And what the industry is doing, because they know every country is not going to align perfectly on every 100 megahertz channel, they're developing tuning ranges where they're, the chip and the antenna will tune across the band, and gosh, if in Australia I can do 3.2 to 3.3 gigahertz, that's great. If I move up the chain or whatever, and I'm in Japan and I can only do 3.4 to 3.6, that's still okay. It's a tuning range. So yes, it matters, but the industry understands we're not going to get harmonization in every line. So they're developing tuning ranges both in the millimeter wave spectrum, like in the 26 gigahertz band and the 40 gigahertz band, as well as the mid-band spectrum. Thank you.
So, Evan, I have two questions, and you can decide which one you want to answer. What does winning mean? That's one. And the second one is, why is Noah unhappy?
I'm sorry? Why is Noah unhappy? I'll answer both. How about that?
Okay.
Well, I'll tell you what it meant for the U.S. to win the race to 4G. I think, if you don't believe the hype, just look back to history as your guide. Don't take my word for it. When we were transitioning to 4G 10, 12 years ago, think about just how different our economy was overall. Biggest companies in the country were banks and energy companies, like oil companies. Today, it's not even close. It's tech companies. And that happened on the 4G network. That mobile innovation happened on the 4G network. We blew our competitors out of the water on 4G after the US struggled on 3G when compared to Europe and Japan. And we have a $950 billion app economy that rides over that network. None of that would have been possible. And what did we do to win the race to 4G? The same thing we're doing now. We allocated spectrum and we updated our infrastructure rules to reflect the new technology. So winning is important for what Tricia was talking about. When these international conversations are taking place, the countries that are ahead in terms of their deployments are going to have a stronger hand to play in terms of the standard setting and other aspects. But then it's just a basic innovation thing. If you're an entrepreneur and your idea only works on a 5G network and you want to test it, you want to experiment, where are you going to go? You're going to go to the country that has a functional 5G network. That could be the US, or it could be China, or it could be somewhere else. So we want to attract as much of that investment here. On the other question you asked, there have been some squabbles between agencies about spectrum allocation, and I'll just say the main point is that we need to be aggressive in our allocation of spectrum. We need to be good. We need to share spectrum where possible. And in general, there's always this tension between government that is a holder of spectrum and the private sector, and that's been going on for decades. And that is manifesting itself in some ways, but I'll leave it at that.
So, Francella, do you have a favorite part of the spectrum? Mid-band, low-band, high?
I don't, but
You haven't picked a winner yet? Okay.
I do have two comments that I just want to respond to something, because I think that while we might agree on the same original set of facts, I do see it slightly differently than Evan in terms of whether or not we're winning. And I think a lot about what this feels like if you're in communities who are disconnected. It worries me the most when I think about the fact that if 5G does put connectivity on steroids for people who are connected. The problem is that we have the ones who have either marginal or no connectedness over here. We have the people who have this outrageous, hyper-intense connectivity here, and it essentially hardens this chasm in between those two groups. And so essentially, I totally agree that there's lots of innovation, billions of dollars in app networks and all sorts of video gaming that happen even on a 4G system, which will be even more exciting on a 5G network. However, I just think about who's going to have access to it. And I think that very often, something that Sanjay said, when I appreciate Sanjay's background on how difficult it is to essentially bring fiber wire line into somebody's neighborhood, and then you have to make sure that they have the right technicians or the right know-how to be able to maintain those networks. And I think that it's difficult, and it's important to be able to bring that to light. However, it does concern me when we focus a lot on why it's hard for a company to do something that essentially consumers are going to end up paying for them to do it. So the truth is, yeah, it's going to be hard to bring 5G to somebody's neighborhood, but you better believe I'm paying a $20 a month premium to make sure that I'm getting 5G access. So essentially, companies are positioned to recoup their cost, and they also have a larger platform to be able to explain why it's difficult for them to do what they do. However, a lot of the member cities that we have, they don't make it into Washington, D.C. They don't have a voice on the docket. They don't get to input on federal policy. They don't get to go to their state legislator and say, this isn't working for us, and there isn't always a legitimate effort to solicit their comments in the actual process, other than just saying, oh, this is open for comment, maybe we're interested, maybe we're not. And I essentially worry about whose voices are heard, because the truth is that larger companies have a bigger platform and lobbyists to make sure that everyone knows how they feel about certain issues, but I worry about some of our smaller cities, like somebody in Sebring, Michigan, who has less than 3,000 in their population, who essentially they will shoulder the burden of whatever that federal or even state policy is, but they might not have a voice in shaping it.
So how do we fill that delta? What do you recommend?
Well, I think that the first step is making sure that we make an intentional effort to actually reach out to those communities. Because the truth is, saying, oh, something's open on the docket, that's insufficient. I think that definitely, I appreciate, like Commissioner Carr's, I follow his LinkedIn when I see which cities he's gone to, because remember I asked him about when he was in Nairobi. I genuinely appreciate going and seeing what our cities doing. And sometimes that's going to take, I know that Commissioner Rosenworcel, several of other commissioners have done the same, so I totally agree with that.
I think sending an FCC commissioner to every community, knocking on the door saying, hey, did you hear we have filings coming? Might get a little expensive, but I appreciate that. No,
Right.
I'm teasing you, but
Yeah, I understand.
Is there a better way? Interwebs help? I don't like.
Well, I also think that I guess just in general, the general proposition isn't about every single docket. I think it's about meaningful effort. And I think that there isn't necessarily a strategy to do some sort of comprehensive outreach to people who are normally not represented in the docket. And in addition to that, I remember last year, it was back in September, Commissioner Rosenworcel made a really thoughtful comment, and she was just saying, if we are going to have to deploy hundreds of thousands of small cells and millions of miles of fiber throughout the United States, we're gonna have to use creative thinking. And that means that maybe in some communities you say, hey, Verizon, if you wanna come into our community, you can go ahead and set up here, but we're gonna need you to also serve that community next door. Or doing different, like whether it's based on policy, whether or not it's just having meetings and actually talking to community leaders. I feel like all of those efforts are at least thoughtful and meaningful efforts.
So let's talk about use cases. What are the use cases that would fire up your constituency base? Like, is there something that appeals to them more? I mean, obviously the geeks have the super geeky stuff we get real excited about, but like, what does the person who's just finding out about 5G, what do you lay out in front of them? They're like, oh, that's cool, I'd like that.
Well, there are a couple of things that we use as a resource to our members. So for example, if they're just setting up broadband, we do have a broadband toolkit. One of my colleagues, Kat, was in the room, I'm pretty sure, Kat Blake, oh, there she is, and she was in charge of putting that together. And that's something that actually has a lot of good resources for city members who are basically like, these are some of our concerns, these are some of the things that other cities have done to either navigate around some of the problems. It addresses things like, it might include comments on preemption, on rights of way, on what do you do when essentially there are federal and state policies that might essentially collide with some local efforts. So I think that in general, it's just at least giving them an opportunity to say, this is how people are handling it in Atlanta or Detroit, and basically giving them some sort of resources to engage.
I feel like you should start with it. You're going to be a social studies teacher on after this. You're like, here's how this process works. Get engaged with your government.
There's nothing wrong
All
with
kinds
that.
of good. No, I'm with you. I'm totally. Yeah, I've been into that for a long time. Okay, other use cases. Panel, what do you guys think is
Just go down the line.
Whichever.
All right. One that we're really excited about is telemedicine. This is something that we've been focused on at the FCC. We're working to stand up a pilot program to support, essentially broadband connections for low-income Americans who can't afford a connection and otherwise cannot avail themselves of some of the telehealth technologies that are coming down the pike. Right now, we're seeing a big trend in healthcare as we face things like hospital closures or a shortage of specialists, particularly in low-income areas or rural areas, that telemedicine, the internet can bridge that doctor divide, not just the digital divide, but the doctor divide. And when you look at healthcare spending in the US, an enormous percentage of it is just chronic disease management. Things like diabetes, where it can be incredibly burdensome and expensive for someone in a rural area who's an hour or two from a hospital to go back and forth to do A1C testing. But with a Bluetooth-enabled glucometer and an iPad, which they can get from the hospital, as long as they have broadband, they can update that on a daily basis and get immediate recommendations from their nurse on what to do without taking on that burden. Whether it's psychiatry, high-risk pregnancy, there are a lot of great use cases here. And with 5G, not just on the high band, but mid-band and low band, all these bands, it's an all-of-the-above approach. These telehealth opportunities will be unlocked for Americans. So a lot of the news articles, naturally, we're going to focus on like video games and stuff like that, and that's great. I love video games. But we're talking about like real life-saving technology here, and that's why we think it's so important to make sure this technology is deployed expeditiously, because it can mean life and death for people in Southwest rural Virginia or South Dakota or wherever, where they are facing these rural challenges for healthcare. So that's a big use case for us. I just want to echo also Sanjay. A lot of people are frustrated right now that they only have 1 or 0 options for home broadband. Having that competitive option through 5G home wireless is something we're excited about as well, to drive down prices and to increase competition for people's broadband dollars.
I don't have a favorite application, but one of the technologies or applications underlying the telemedicine or telehealth application that Evan's talking about is mobile edge computing, and that's already happening under 4G, but that's going to be enhanced under 5G, and you're going to have more computing power in your consumer device, whether it's a phone or a tablet or whatever, to do those health applications, and including in the more suburban and rural areas. So I think it's a technology underlying a number of different applications, but particularly will be helpful for certainly telemedicine.
So I think right now, the discussion about what will we use 5G for, in some sense, we are sort of limited by our own imagination. So think back when the iPhone was first introduced and LTE first came out. We all sort of knew, okay, it's got a screen, we got high capacity, well, we can do video streaming. We pretty much expected that, right? So Netflix was, at that point, something you could predict. None of us really thought about the sharing economy, right? Uber and Lyft and share, whatever the heck you share nowadays. No one really thought about that because we weren't thinking along the lines of this can do more than just stream video, because video is what we were used to. So right now, to some extent, I would say with 5G, we're at that space where we have some ideas of what it will enable. But really, 5 years from now is when we'll have things that we never even thought about. The sharing economy equivalent will be coming. We just don't know what it is. Having said that, the thing that really interests me is the education and training piece that 5G will enable. More specifically, when we talk about augmented reality, virtual reality, right now, I've got 2 girls going to middle school, and they have iPads, which is great. You don't have to lug, tons of textbooks along. But it's very much a 2-dimensional thing. So if you're talking about education where you can now do something where it's immersive, you're not just talking about the pyramids in Egypt, you're actually visiting them virtually as a whole class. That's where it becomes interesting. In Verizon, we're looking at how to train our technicians using augmented reality. So when they are fixing those small cells, they can look at the small cell and they can see a diagram of what it's supposed to look like. And if they run into problems, the supervisor is there, as a little screen where they can now interact with them. So those are the scenarios where it's possible to do that now on a small scale, but to make it work on a large scale is difficult, partly because of, nobody wants to wear those clunky goggles. And oh, by the way, when you're having those, no one talks about the big backpack with the computer in it that you have to have nearby. So if all of those things, a big chunk of that can move into the network, which is what 5G enables when we deploy the multi-access edge compute, yet another mouthful of technology. A lot of that stuff, the computing goes into the network. So what you end up with is devices that are very portable, potentially very lightweight, and potentially cheap, right? So if you add that combination, especially in spaces where, schools and other places, that becomes a very interesting solution. So that to me is sort of the interesting thing. And last, because we're at the stage where we don't really know, all the different things we can do, we have started up a whole bunch of labs across the country where each lab is focused on different things. The one in DC is focused on first responders. What can we come up with in terms of being creative? So any startup can come to us and use the 5G hotspot to, play around with it. Same thing, we're doing challenges in schools where we're saying, what can you come up with? Because we can build a network, we're good at that, but we can't come up with all the hundreds of different applications. That's going to be up to the rest of the world. So.
I have this vision of a bunch of Verizon engineers talking to 5-year-olds. What did you think? What else can we do with this?
I actually had to go speak to a 3rd grade class about the internet. That was an interesting challenge.
Did they come up with some good ideas? All right, you mentioned edge computing. This is a smart crowd, so let's go there. Explain to us how the actual technology is changing with network virtualization. You also mentioned security, so are we feeling as safe as we bring this out to the edge?
Sure. So the edge computing, the MEC, and I've said this many times, don't let engineers name stuff, because we're not very creative. What it does is, so up to now, when we talk about 2G, 3G, 4G, it's basically just a faster network connecting you to whatever you're going to. What the MEC changes is you're now moving the computing, the processing capability closer to the customer, closer to the consumer, where now we're talking single-digit, double-digit miles instead of potentially hundreds to thousands of miles. What does that do? That reduces the lag, the reaction time between you doing something and you getting a response, down to single-digit milliseconds. Why does that matter? Because one of the issues we have with augmented reality, virtual reality, is that if there's a lag, it's disorienting for the person. You start getting nauseous. You can't really stay in that environment for too long. If you can now remove that lag and make it, essentially not noticeable, you open up a whole new world of things that you couldn't do before. So what is the Mac physically? It's just a PC. It's a PC on steroids. But it's a PC, generic off-the-shelf hardware, but it's running software that now integrates it into the 5G network. So you can now create slices of capabilities where whether you want it to be low latency, high speed, whatever your criteria. And that's the other way I look at 5G. It's not one network. Think of it as a network that will adapt to whatever you need. If you just need speed, yeah, we can do that. Not very exciting, but we can do that. But if you need speed plus a combination of low latency plus reliability, those are some of the knobs you can now play with to get whatever your service needs. That's where it gets really interesting.
So I know one of the concerns was the people that are being left behind. Let's talk about the people that got there first. Like Indianapolis was one of the first ones to get adoption. Mm-hmm. What did they do as a community? What made them interesting to you guys to move there?
So I wasn't directly involved in the negotiations, so I don't know all the specifics.
You were busy talking to grade school children about ideas on the computer.
I can answer that.
Go for it.
Wait,
Go ahead, Smarty Pants. What?
Well, I'll just, because part of the Indiana example is how it informed the regulatory reforms that we took at the FCC. So there were states like Indiana, cities like Indianapolis, cities like Fishers, Indiana, that made a decision. They said, we want this connectivity here in our city. We know the economic benefits we will get when the network is built, and we view the network as an economic opportunity, not a revenue opportunity. And what do I mean by that? They said, our opportunity here as a city and as a state government is not in taxing the deployment and raising money off of the actual infrastructure deployment. Their opportunity, they said, was we're going to be one of the first ones to 5G, and then we're going to have entrepreneurship, things we can't even imagine yet. We're going to attract people to come to Indiana and experiment on the network. So they basically passed a state law that limited the fees that you could charge for the deployment of small cells, and they also put in shot clocks to ensure that the permits were granted expeditiously. And that's one of the reasons why Indiana is a leader in 5G. There are other state laws as well that essentially informed the FCC's approach. There are about 27 now US states that have passed a small cell legislation at the state capitol, and the vast majority of those bills are actually more aggressive in terms of providing regulatory relief than the guardrails that the FCC put in place. But I think that's just an example of a philosophical way of looking at the economic opportunity of broadband. Is the opportunity in getting the network and getting the innovation, or is it an opportunity to try to raise revenue off of the infrastructure deployment? And we think that Indiana got it right, and they informed our approach.
And can I just add
Sure.
something really quickly? I think what you're saying is true. The caveat to that is saying that it is conditioned on everyone who's within that state having fast, reliable connectivity. So that's part of the issue, because if you have it in Indianapolis and maybe the larger cities, what happens in South Bend? What happens in some of the smaller cities who might be a little bit farther behind? And when I think about if you're a local leader who's essentially trying to navigate around some of those federal and also state regulations that might say, like, for example, I actually brought one from Delaware because this was interesting to me. There was one, and it says, it was a House bill in 2017, and it says the department may not charge an application fee or rate or for the use of a right-of-way with respect to the construction, installation, mounting, maintenance, modification, operation, or replacement of a small wireless support structure in the right-of-way. The issue is, especially for local leaders, if they have to navigate around that where they're saying, I can't recoup the cost maybe to install, to put some certain things in right-of-way, or the administrative cost to do the permitting, or maybe to get ahead of that shot clock. There are all of these things that they're trying to work around. I just want to bring attention to the fact that those local leaders are the ones who have to navigate that and also answer to the local businesses who might have an obstruction right in front of their business or an antenna in their kid's backyard. Those are the questions that they need to answer, where in theory in Washington, D.C., that is amazing, and it might be amazing in Indianapolis. I just want to make sure that the people in South Bend and smaller cities who might not have the same resources or results still get a voice.
Yeah, I'll just briefly respond. I 100% agree. The finish line for 5G is not when we get 20 cities. That's exciting news, but as Sanjay said, we've got a long way to go. And the finish line for 5G is when every community has a fair shot at getting this next-gen connectivity, not just New York and San Francisco, who might be on the first list because they're densely populated and they're an attractive place to deploy. And I would say that, yeah, one of the goals with removing costs from the system is to leave more money available for capital. Money that is going into an excessive fee is not going to deployment. And that said, I 100% agree. No one should be subsidizing, no taxpayer should be subsidizing this deployment. The FCC made very clear that cities are well within their rights to recoup the cost of the applications and the cost of maintaining the poles, and there's even a little headroom there for maybe some extra. But that Delaware statute, I'm not familiar with it, but that is not something that the FCC did.
Yes, I understand.
Evan, you touched on workforce. So it sounds like we have a lot of work ahead of us if we even get enough people to agree that this is a good idea. How are we doing on that?
So this is truly incredible. So we've spent a lot of time with tower crews. I mean, these are the men and women that literally deploy this infrastructure. They put tools on their back, they clip harnesses onto their bodies, and they climb either 200 feet if they're swapping out a 4G antenna with a 5G antenna, or they're getting in a bucket truck and going up to a light pole in the middle of Washington, D.C. It's hard work, it's often gritty work, and these are solidly middle-class jobs with great career opportunities. The eye-popping statistic is that there are about 29,000 of these men and women actively working in the U.S. today. The industry estimates that with current and future demand, particularly as it relates to 5G, they can add another 20,000, nearly doubling their workforce. And again, the macro statistic is backed up by the anecdote at the ground level. We've talked to crews, big company in Texas that wants to hire 500 workers at one facility. We've talked to crews that are 5 guys that want to be 10. People just want to double because the demand is so great. Now, the issue is, how do we get these workers up to speed and get them to safely deploy this infrastructure? My boss has been working with the National Wireless Safety Alliance and other stakeholders to look to community colleges as a way of getting these up and running. A lot of Americans right now, they're saddled with student debt. They've gone for the 4-year degree, and maybe it wasn't something they wanted to do, but they felt like that was their only option. There are worker training programs, 7 to 12 weeks. There's one in South Carolina that we visited at Aiken Technical College. You can do that program. Effectively, 100% of their graduates get a job offer from a tower company either before or after graduating. 7 to 12 weeks. That's at a community college, which is important to us because that gives you access to Pell Grants, to VA funding, and the social safety net associated with community colleges. But companies are doing a lot to train their workers themselves, but there is a shortage, and there's a lot of focus now on how do we bridge that gap, because you can allocate all the spectrum in the world, you can reform your regulations on infrastructure, but if you don't have human beings to deploy the infrastructure, it's not going to happen.
Another thing that you all have focused on, which is interesting because it reminds us that sometimes it is getting outside of the cities, is the agriculture aspects of it. With how do we get this technology out of just the cities and make things like precision agriculture better ways to utilize our land mass. Still fascinated that there's also drones that can figure out what's a plant and what's a weed, but amazing stuff going on out there. So explain to us why the cows need to be connected. That was kind of a thing for you guys for a while.
Cows definitely need to be connected. If any of you own an unconnected cow, I take personal offense to that. So yeah, there's a lot of great examples of precision ag. I mean, farmers now and cattle ranchers are using data for everything, whether it's soil moisture levels, whether it's a Internet of Things fly trap that can literally trap a pest, upload the data to the cloud, and then AI determines what pest it is and what it means for their crop. It's also important for sustainability to lower the number of pesticides that are used, to reduce water waste, all sorts of great things happening with precision ag that you need connectivity for, and that's one place where the Universal Service Fund comes into effect. The FCC has a $10 billion a year fund that is used to bring connectivity to those that do not have it. So thank you all for paying that tax on your phone bills. But there's some great success stories of broadband coming to agricultural communities, allowing people to stay in those communities and allowing the farmers and cattle ranchers to do what they need to do to feed our population, essentially. And there are just so many different ways that this is already being used. A lot of smart ag equipment is already 4G connected. They're excited for the upgrade to 5G, but one story just to kind of paint the picture, we met with a farmer who had a a coffee cup on his desk with USB drives in it. We were like, okay, well, what's that about? And he said, farmers are collecting enormous amounts of data, offline essentially in the field, but because they don't necessarily have the connection at home to upload it to the cloud, they're going to a church, they're going to McDonald's, they're going wherever they can to upload that data, and that slows down the process of the cloud computing and AI bringing that to bear to do stuff with this data. So that's one of the reasons why the Universal Service Fund is important, and bringing connectivity to these unserved areas, particularly where the business case is difficult. It could cost $30,000 to lay a mile of fiber. If you live in a town where there's one person per mile, that's going to be tough to make a business case there. So that's where, the Universal Service Fund can make a difference.
So when the National Cattlemen Association start putting in for spectrum licenses, we'll all understand why. Tricia, is that the same excitement globally? Are we seeing that people are wanting connected cows all across the world?
All around the world, particularly in Switzerland and the other places with the cows. But
They've had a communication system with those bells for a long time.
They do need that. But I just wanted to go back to Indiana. I just wanted to note that Indiana's in the Midwest, and there are nicer people in the Midwest than those sharp-elbowed politicians on the coast. I'm just saying, maybe that's something why we
They were
have
able
more
to
of those.
collaborate to a solution.
Yeah.
I'm a New York City native.
I know you are, and that's what I'm talking about. So, that obviously the political environment, people have to want to, invite the innovation into their cities and not try to, as you said, extract rents. And obviously the higher cost, that will flow down, and it will disincent people like Verizon to actually move to cities that are smaller and where they're not going to get those revenues. But globally, I think globally people do understand the impact that 5G will have, across the range of society's needs. And, particularly in Asia, as Francella was speaking about, you weren't talking about Asia, but, the application of technologies to all of society's needs, whether they're education or in Japan, they have an aging population, and they're really looking at 5G in terms of elder health and, and some of the telehealth issues that Evan has mentioned. So yes, 5G globally, it's not seen just as a way to get, the rich city slickers, faster videos of, what was the movie this year? Avengers or whatever, whatever kids are watching this year, that's not where the emphasis is globally. It is, how do we address societal, issues generally? And, a lot of that is education, certainly, and well, a range of issues. So it's not just the U.S. that is looking at 5G as a broad range of possible solutions to society's issues. It's definitely a global movement.
So do the people that are looking at this from a local perspective put into account things that they'll be able to do some sort of transfer of funds? So if you have a better idea of where you need to, the example I always love is in Boston, even though I'm going to channel Dr. Nicole Turnerly, he's not in the room at the moment. She says, it's one thing to say you're going to find out where the potholes are because people's smartphones are bumping, and they're like, if you don't have a smartphone in your car, you're not going to know where that is. But as we get more information with these small shoebox things that have the lifespan of a guinea pig, and more data, will they be able to change where they're spending funding? I'm just thinking there's ways that you can do kind of a transfer. So it's a bit of a spend, but there's a save somewhere else.
Yeah, and I actually think that a lot of the cities, especially whether they're cities that are member communities of Next Century Cities or just cities that are just working on connectivity and looking for solutions, I actually think everybody agrees that 5G is going to be amazing when it gets there. I think that everybody thinks it's going to help reduce costs for certain things by creating apps where people can report the potholes. They can report whether it's clean air in their neighborhoods, different things. I think that it's great. And one of the things that I do want to point out is that part of the reason why it has gone to places like Indianapolis or San Francisco or Baltimore is because there's the political will and an agreement that 5G should accommodate everyone where they are. And I think you brought up a good example about precision agriculture. This is two international examples. So one side of my family is from Antigua. People use their smartphones to actually report what crops they have, and also to, if you grow, for example, cucumbers, you can go and sort out your different cucumbers by taking a picture of it. It basically creates a file, and this is great. This is wonderful. And this is also a place in Johnson's Point, Antigua, where there's not a lot of connectivity. It's not really that great. And on the other side of my family, we're actually from Nairobi, Lua people from a small place, Kisumu Village. coverage, where again, when you have that type of remote connectivity, you can use that when you go to the market to process payments on your cell phone. So the thing is, but when you're thinking about how those governments are thinking about whether it's 5G, 3G, whatever it is, there's actually the political will to say, to meet people wherever they are for whatever application it's going to be helpful to them. And so I think that that's the part that I feel like some people call it digital equity, some people just call it about, talking about the allocation of resources. I think there has to be an acknowledgement that everyone should benefit from the technology.
Sure.
Yeah, unlike in the U.S. where, most of us are, for the young people in the room, your parents, first experienced broadband on a fixed computer, PC in your house, the developing world has experienced the internet primarily over the mobile phone. So again, so they get it. For 5G or 4G, they understand that this is impacting, commerce, across the board because, that they didn't have fixed broadband connections. So the excitement globally on what could be next with 5G, you definitely feel it, particularly in the developing world.
Any last thoughts from our panelists before I open it up to the room? Anything you haven't brought out to our attention yet? Done okay so far? All right. Do we have mic runners? Oh, okay, we've got a gentleman right up here in front. And please just tell us who you are and why you're here, your favorite color, something that's interesting.
I like that.
Hi, my name is Chen from GWU. I have a burning question.
A burning question?
I'm very confused at the moment.
All right, let's unconfuse you.
The differences between 4G and 5G, and the president has made some remarks about 5G. China seems to be ahead of us, or we seem to be ahead of China. I don't know where we are now. Thank you.
Okay. Does anybody want to decide if China's winning the race?
So there's not an easy way to measure who's ahead, right? I mean, we are deploying very aggressively. In fact, we're limited by the number of components we can get as far as hardware itself and how much fiber we can lay. So as a country, I think we are definitely not behind. You can measure things in different ways. I think someone measured the number of small cells being deployed in China as more for a given area, or there's some combination of numbers you can always use to show that one country is ahead or not. But I think the fact remains that we were the first to deploy 5G in a commercial network. I think we beat South Korea by 8 minutes, 10 minutes, something like that. Bragging rights.
So somebody's
we beat
counting,
Verizon.
apparently.
It was very close. But that was just bragging rights, right? So some of these things are more marketing speak where it's like, okay, I'm ahead or you're ahead. But really in terms of the ecosystem being developed, the amount of work we're doing, the FCC and others are helping in kind of making sure we can deploy on a large scale. I think that's what really matters. It's not a question of, well, who got it deployed first in, 1 square mile, because that's not going to drive the industry. What's going to drive the industry is how much of the country has 5G in place. That's where you get really interesting things happening. So I would say it's not a question of, who's winning. I mean, you can measure it different ways and you can say whoever, but really it's how aggressive is everyone being in deploying.
And yeah, I'll follow up on that. And obviously the rallying cry of we have to win the race to 5G has been political to get more spectrum out of the FCC. Whether we're winning or not, well, it has been.
Evan, give up the spectrum.
Pardon?
Well, that sounds like that would solve the problem, just tell him.
Yeah. But, whether we're winning or not, so I don't want to say we're winning because, we want more spectrum to the market. But
We're not winning yet.
We're very close. But Sanjay's right. There has been more deployments of real 5G to date in the United States. Now, China has a very different system from us, right? So they can just allocate spectrum, and they've done that. For their 3 national carriers that all are, government-owned, if not affiliated, well, they're all government-owned, have all gotten a slice, a nice, healthy, chunky slice of mid-band spectrum and also millimeter wave spectrum. So they've been given the spectrum, or they've gotten the spectrum. Unlike the United States, China has one tower company, again, a government-owned entity that has to serve its 3 competitors. They do compete, but they're all government-owned competitors. One China tower company that has to serve all three, and it's, you know, it's kind of easy over there, right? And of course, they have just more humans, right? So, you know, they're going to have more small cells or, you know, antennas deployed generally because they have that structure. But, you know, when you look at where the innovation is going to come from, and, you know, you've got the demand for different, you know, deployments in different cities, I think in the long run, the U.S. will continue to be the winning, you know, nation in that kind of race because of our free market structure that does reward risk capital.
So a few points on the board for central planning, but capitalism can still pull ahead in the race. Next question, we got it over here.
Hi, my name is Sohail. I'm currently a consultant with the World Bank's digital development practice. My question is regarding shocks to the broader 5G ecosystem at a global level. For example, we do know that Huawei is a very important vendor of 5G electronic equipment globally, and that harmonization of standards is required to achieve those economies of scale that Patricia spoke about earlier. So, of course, tuning ranges and so on can be employed to alleviate some of those tensions regarding harmonizing standards. But what is the impact, in the panel's opinion, on isolating a company like Huawei, which does have some influence as a vendor of 5G technology?
Anybody want to take that? I can go with moderator's prerogative, but yes. So people love to talk about how Huawei is high quality and low cost, and there's a reason for both of those. They're high quality because they stole the IP, and they're low cost because they're backed by the Chinese government. So again, chalk a few points up for central planning and the Chinese, and, you know, and we're trying to say that, you know, there's still a lot of room for capitalism to win on that. But part of that is understanding that we also have to protect our national security. And so there's a big debate about that. You have to kind of decide who you trust and who you choose to be partners with. And there's a lot of people that I think have really been outspoken on this that have had some good reasons why we should be concerned. You know, 4G, we can still cabin certain parts of the network off, which you can use Huawei equipment in. 5G, when we're going to network virtualization and software-defined networking, we're going to have a very hard time, as a colleague of ours, Roger Entner, who's an analyst, says, you don't need a backdoor because they're coming straight in the front door with software.
I'll just add, you know, one reason why we want the U.S. to lead is so that we have the strongest seat at the table. And it's not just about the 5G network, it's about what values do you want in your network. Do you want that network to have values like freedom of speech, respect for intellectual property, the rule of law? And we do have a very different system than China, but I would double down on the free market approach we took with 4G any day, and I will bet on American ingenuity any day.
Go ahead. And one thing that actually brings up is something that's very important to our city members is always thinking about, if you are thinking about how we're building secure systems in the city, the truth is that smaller towns are just getting their hands around the little bit of connectivity that they have. And so it's really hard to introduce X factors and companies that essentially have legitimate concerns about their data practices. It's really difficult to start incorporating that into their ecosystem when essentially we have to be thinking not only about providing people with reliable access, but secure access, because cities have to be, you know, good stewards of that data and information.
And I was just going to follow up on the standards point. You know, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, we all know, I mean, you know, China has a lot of engineers, right? They have a lot of people. They've focused on that as an educational, you know, policy, whereas we were kind of more, well, capitalist, right? Just let your kids be French, 12th century poet majors if they want.
They're a lot of fun at cocktail parties, right?
Yeah,
Great.
they're very fun at parties. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so they have a lot of engineers, and the international standards system obviously is all contribution driven. So you know, they do have an advantage in numbers by just bringing more proposals to those standards bodies, and you know, so that is a real problem, and or you know, it's a real challenge, I guess. But I think the U.S. government has woken up to that threat, and they're trying to do a little bit more. Not threat, it's a reality. So they've woken up to that, and they are doing what they can to help support better participation by U.S. entities, tech companies, as well as kind of more allied, you know, friendly country companies. So they are trying to respond to that inherent advantage that Huawei, you know, let alone if they were doing the things that, you know, folks know they're doing. just in terms of the numbers and supporting competitive technology, the U.S. has realized they got to better support the industry.
I do think we have the challenge that, technology has been plug and play. It's so easy to just, navigate, and people don't understand what it took to get there. And I think we're learning a lot of that now, not just with Huawei, but with mineral rights and the semiconductor issues. I think, for those of us who follow all the different levels of this, there's just a lot going on in the trade. It's fascinating. It's a great time to be in this space.
If I can just add one more thing to
Sure.
that. So nothing about Huawei. My colleagues kind of summarize it really nicely, I think. But the one thing that I think is relevant that's not really discussed as much is, yes, supply chain matters, specific vendors might be of concern. But whatever you do after that, even if it's, you're not using that particular vendor, the operational aspect of the network is absolutely critical. It's not enough to have, good equipment and good fiber and then you're done. If you don't have a daily sort of operational team that is looking at every possible aspect from a security perspective and acting on it, the best network in the world is not going to be very good. So I think that's the one that gets lost in the noise about, specific vendors or whatever. Yes, all of those is valid. All of that is valid. We have about over 1,000 security professionals looking at our network every single day. So if you are someone who's deploying your own 5G network and you don't have some high level of security capability, that's a concern. I don't care what equipment you have. So that's the one thing I would say, we need to look at the operational part also, not just the initial deployment.
Biggest thing of the day, the smartest guy in the room says worry about security, okay? Who else has questions? Over here in front. Mike's coming right at you. And you guys kind of match.
So you talked about 5G.
Sorry, could you tell us who you are and what your favorite color is?
That is
I'm so
Marielle
excited.
Triggs, Spectrum extraordinaire. I follow her work, and she's never met me in person.
Oh, wow.
Well, that's funny because I'm
So
a
you're
fan
gonna
and
be
I was going to
cute right
stalk you
here.
afterwards.
Like a celebrity sighting.
Did you want to introduce her? Right.
So you talked about Marielle Triggs, MuralNet, and not as cool as you. But you talked about 5G and the millimeter wave, and it's pretty obvious what it's going to do for the concrete canyons of cities. But I'm wondering about the rural areas like the Grand Canyon and things of that sort. You mentioned mid-band and fixed wireless, and I can see what you would do there. But I heard, I think it was Commissioner Carr talk about low-band use of 5G and getting 50 megabytes per second down. Is Verizon looking into this, or if so, can you tell us more?
So I'm not going to go into any specifics of what we're planning, but that's a great question. So to me, when someone says, is this spectrum good or is this spectrum bad? I kind of go, it's kind of like asking me, what's the best car, right? Well, it depends. What are you trying to do? I mean, is it the most luxurious car? Maybe it's a Rolls Royce. Maybe it's a Lamborghini. Maybe it's a Tesla. Maybe it's a school bus if you're trying to move 20 people at the same time, right? So same thing happens with spectrum. There is no good spectrum or bad spectrum, right? Millimeter wave spectrum, if you're trying to blanket the whole country, is bad spectrum because it doesn't go that far, so you're going to have a lot more small cells. Low band spectrum, if you're trying to cover a huge area, is great for that. It might not have the same capacity as millimeter wave. Mid-band is sort of in between for both of them. So the idea that there is, millimeter wave is only for the city, it's not because only cities deserve it. It's just the use case right now makes sense in that location. Doesn't mean you wouldn't do millimeter wave elsewhere if the use case pops up. So.
When I was and I thought you were looking at me, and I was going to say, you're a celebrity in my mind too. I saw you testify last
Everybody's
week at the
fangirling up here.
Spectrum hearing. You did great. It was very exciting.
I will start following you right away.
Yeah,
Just saying.
I do. But this raises a point, and there's a 5G ecosystem, right? So you cannot rely, if you're in the bottom of the Grand Canyon, on terrestrial mobile broadband alone. I think you're going to need some kind of backhaul, whether it's satellite or high altitude platforms, the solar planes that Facebook or the Loon, that Google is developing or is deploying. So it is an ecosystem. So you're going to need more than just licensed terrestrial spectrum for 5G, and including Wi-Fi for more offload. With each generation of the Gs, you've had more offload to Wi-Fi, so you need more of that too. But so you're going to need some affordable satellite spectrum. And, they're getting faster, better too. They would certainly argue that they're part of the 5G ecosystem.
Well, and the loon was an interesting time, especially for Puerto Rico, where they were just, parts of it were dark, and Google's able to take this thing they had over South America and brought it over and, lit up parts of the country that just didn't have any connectivity. So it showed us some really good examples.
Yeah, and at least one carrier has used spectrum that was originally for television in the 600 megahertz band, which goes very far, obviously. We're all familiar with that. They've already started to use that in 5G, and then in the mid-band, you're seeing some use cases as well. So I think that's why it's so important when we talk about the all of the above approach. It's not just going to be small cells, of course, in every area. In a lot of these areas, the existing towers that have 4G antennas today will be swapped with 5G antennas, which will increase their speeds. And 5G will be pushed down, not just in the high band, but that technology will be pushed down to the lower bands as well.
Everyone gets a trophy, all spectrum. How about the back of the room? Joe, we were waiting for you to show up. Do you have any questions? Nope, you just absorbing? Eating, okay, got it. Anyone else? Questions? We answered it all? All right, Barry.
Thank you. Barry Cobb, independent consultant. 5G is definitely not my ballywick.
Did you learn today? Tell us you learned something.
I'm sorry?
You learned something though, right? You were in the room?
Absolutely.
Okay,
I
just
definitely
checking.
appreciated the conversation about the spectrum. Not being close to this, it's disappointing to see the misplaced propaganda about how people will use, well, why are they doing a small millimeter spectrum for this? And just from an outsider perspective, it's discouraging.
The 5GE on your AT&T phone means evolution. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, exactly.
Shots fired.
So, I guess for me, and I appreciated the quick history about how we got our butts kicked in 3G, we learned our lessons and competed aggressively in 4G. Now we're in 5G, and I still feel like we're reactive, especially from a policy perspective. And along with that same misplaced propaganda, I'm already hearing 6G. So I guess it's a two-part question, is just a quick distinction of what's happening in the 6G space.
Always be looking forward.
Blanket.
Don't settle for 5 when you can go to 6.
Exactly. And then more importantly, from a policy perspective, what can we be doing now to not be reactive when 6G hits us? Thank you.
Sure. You're going to tell him that he has to chip himself?
Sanjay's going to give like a real good technical answer, but I'm just going to say we were not reactive internationally on spectrum. It was really the US that pushed the agenda item to look at the millimeter wave spectrum globally. And one little tip, or not a tip, nobody cares but me probably, maybe
I
Evan.
doubt that. We probably all care.
The agendas for the next World Radio Conference are negotiated at the current one. So in 2015, the US was really pushing the agenda item to study the millimeter wave spectrum for international, for this current work, for the WARC 19 that's, in October to November, and because the US was trying to get out ahead of that. And they also, the FCC had proposals to allocate spectrum, which they've now done, and they've had a number of the auctions, about half of the auctions in the millimeter wave spectrum, but they got that proposal out going into the World Radio Conference in 2015 to really, be leaders globally to say, look, this spectrum, we think it's real. We have a proposal, we've got this and that. So we were not reactive. We were definitely leading that agenda on the millimeter wave spectrum. You could argue mid-band, was the last administration, did they make some false steps, or did they deal with the hand they had to in the mid-band space and what we call the citizen broadband radio space? That is for another panel to debate. But we definitely led it. On 6G, as I've observed in my practice, it's usually the vendors that are pushing the next G because they want to sell new equipment. The truth is both 4G, and certainly is going to be the case for 5G, has a very long tail. You have lots of different features, and Sanjay can explain this all to better technical clarity than I can. But you've got lots of different flavors and applications in both the 4G and 5G. So it's a very, very long tail. But yes, there is work being done already on 6G. But the 5G is going to take us, into the late 2020s.
Yeah.
So I agree that we've been proactive. I mean, on the infrastructure side, we view these as proactive measures to make sure our rules are 5G ready so that when people are coming to deploy, the rules are not what hold people back from getting connectivity. But You brought up 6G, and yes, 5G is going to have a very long tail, but at the FCC, we recently have been opening up very, very high spectrum bands that today you would not consider usable for experiments, to basically say to anyone who thinks that they can do something with this terahertz spectrum or 100 gigahertz, whatever, that feel free to experiment on that. And that's an example of being proactive, to say we don't know what this is going to be used for, and we don't know how the network's going to shake out, but let's make sure people have the right to experiment on those networks so that we're not, they're not coming back, 20 years from now and asking for permission.
If I could just add something here, I think sometimes I don't want to, I always want to make sure this is in plain language, especially for people who are looking online who feel like there's a small group of people who speak policy in Washington, D.C. and who know nothing about, I'm from New Orleans, Louisiana, and when I go home, if I told them spectrum, they'd be like, what are you talking about? And that is just real. And I always want to think about bringing it back to what can communities do to get involved. And one of the things we don't always talk about is digital literacy. And I think that we need to invest in making sure that whether it's universities or local libraries or community centers have ways for people to tap into some sort of education about being digital stewards, about building their own networks. In my work in the past year, my work has been focused on highlighting people across the country who are coming up with their own solutions without federal support. I found a professor, Edwin Reed Sanchez, in New York, who is teaching people to use reusable dark fiber to build their own Wi-Fi networks in places like Nairobi and Nicaragua and places with no resources. If you go to Detroit and you talk about the digital connectivity work that they're doing there, they essentially train people in community centers to be digital ambassadors and go knock on door to door, showing people how to connect to the internet, use digital tools. What does it mean to have a cloud? And the thing is, if we aren't doing that type of aggressive outreach to bring new voices into this conversation, we will not be able to dream without a budget. That's just real. Because the people who get to dream are usually companies that have an entire research mechanism behind them. They have millions of dollars and millions of engineers, and what we need to do is tap into new talent, because I refuse to believe that we can't come up with better solutions in small towns and underserved communities that just don't have access, but have these incredible ideas. So if we can tap into that imagination network, I actually think that we're not just gonna be talking about 5G or 6G, we're gonna be talking about how you're using your fingerprint for access and changing the way we think about connectivity.
Yeah, I totally agree with the education piece of it. It's absolutely critical. In fact, that's what I do a lot of, just educating people on how this stuff works, because one of the things, as an engineer I've noticed is that a lot of the policy tends to be made with buzzwords instead of the actual technical details. And so I think anything we can do with that would be, incredibly useful. One thing I will add is that on the education piece, what we've done as Verizon is we're spending about $400 million over the next few years educating the educators in schools in underserved areas. So it's too easy to take technology and drop it in a school and say, here's a bunch of iPads, go use them. What happens is they don't get used, or they get used for things they're not supposed to be used for. So what we've been doing is going in with technology, but then educating the educators, the teachers, on how to use the technology. And the results are actually quite interesting. And so I think, yes, we're spending $400 million, but that's a drop in the bucket compared to what the system actually needs. So, those are the kinds of things I think we need to do, not just for adults, but also at the sort of the grade school level, so that when people come out, it's not just, I know how to use Instagram, it's more than that.
I'm just going to add my mother to that list, too. I'm going to send my mother to the teenagers that are constantly explaining things to her. Last question? Anyone? All right, you guys are going to get some time back in your day. You'll be the first ones to coffee. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our panel.